Welcome today to the Culture Chat. I'm Olivia Bryant, your host. I have joined with me Annemie Verrijken, which is not 100%, but we're almost there on enunciating the last name. Thank you, Annemie, for joining me. Annemie comes from Missouri, but not originally. She actually comes all the way from across the pond in Europe, and she is joining me today to talk about change and all things change related. As a seasoned change leader and certified coach with over 20 years of experience driving successful transformations across sectors, including agriculture, health insurance, and food distribution, she's led change in critical areas, including finance, customer experience, and supply chain, enhancing operational efficiency and employee engagement. So, Annemie, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you have come through this journey to be a change management expert and where your professional career began, and a brief summary of where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So my career and my life started in Antwerp in Belgium. And I actually studied economics. I have a business degree, but always wanted to be a teacher. And I couldn't, when I graduated college, I couldn't find a job as a teacher. And ended up in the corporate world in finance as my first job, but was really wanted to do the teaching maybe later on in life. And so I started a teaching degree in evening school and did that for 3 years, but sort of never left the corporate world from there. I was in finance 5 years in Antwerp in Belgium with Monsanto at the time. And then they transitioned me to Switzerland. Yes, so I spent 8 years in Switzerland in a variety of roles there. You mentioned a couple. Customer experience was part of that. Still some roles in finance, supporting the commercial side. And then after 8 years in Switzerland, I eventually ended up in St. Louis, where I'm located now. And sort of in that transition phase from Switzerland to the US is where I stumbled into change enablement. Yeah, because at the time I was supporting a global project to kind of rethink how we would do customer service on a global level. And there were a lot of different initiatives going on at the time within supply chain, logistics, manufacturing, and as a team starting a new project, we were thinking, we're not so good at implementing change always, as probably many companies. So somebody said, maybe we should do this a little bit differently. And there's this company, ProSci, and many people will recognize ProSci that have done some research and they have a methodology. And so I kind of dug into it a little bit and Googled it at the time and found it very interesting. I went to my superior or my manager at the and asked, hey, can we get some resources to support our change? And he's like, no, but if you want, you can go to training and become the change manager on the project. And so that's how I kind of accidentally stumbled into it. And then when I went to the training, I did the ProSci certification, came back and was like blown away. Like, wow, this is so powerful. I applied it to a change that I was implementing at that time and really saw the power of it. And from then on, I decided that that's what I wanted to do going forward. And then, you don't just switch in one go jobs. So gradually I took on roles where in the beginning, partially change was my role, and then ultimately full-time roles.
So, change, change enablement. I think there's that saying, the only constant thing in life is change. What does this mean? Can you help define change enablement for our listeners?
Yeah. So there's many different definitions out there, but the way kind of I look at it is, change enablement or change management is all about how to intentionally help people go through change. Right? And helping people go through change, that means, we're going from a current way of working to a future way of working, right? And so how do we are intentional about providing people what they need, and help them on that journey? And if you will, create a change journey or experience for them, that's a little bit smoother, right? Because we all know that change can be hard. Change can be challenging because, as human beings, we are wired to stay in our comfort zone, and we don't necessarily like to step out of our comfort zone, right? And that's why change sometimes can be hard, right? And so what is a journey that we can design for them that will make that transition easier for them, and where they can also be, the best they can be?
So you're really describing a mapping of the experience as employees or an organization go through a change management process. It's like a mapped out, defined path that can be taken.
Yes. And it's about that intentionality is important, right? Because there are certain things that you can do really to help people go through that, right? And it's things like helping them to understand what's going on. Why are we doing this? Providing direction on what does this mean to you, and in how is that going to change your role, right? There's a lot that we can do to make people comfortable and kind of going through that.
As you're talking about it, I'm thinking about personal experiences and the scope of work that goes into preparing an organization or even a large team for change. If I think of an organization mid-size, a few thousand employees, everyone's going to experience change differently. You have a background, you've globe-trotted, which is amazing, by the way. I have a background, my upbringing, my career progression, all of these play a role into who we are and how we handle change, like you're talking about. So, how on earth can you, and I imagine a relatively small army of professionals all focused on change enablement, how can you map that out for each individual to experience it in a positive way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And you bring up a good point of change is individual, right? It's ultimately the individual's choice to either engage or disengage, right? But there's a lot that we can really do to contribute that, whether or not they will engage. And mapping out that experience is different for every change, right? It's not like a standard template that you can follow. Although sometimes change enablement has that reputation of like, do these 5 things and you will get there. It all depends on what type of change it is, right? And so when I engage in a change or my team engages, the first thing we do is really understand what's going on, right? And what type of change it is, the scope, like how big is this, right? Are we changing roles and responsibilities? Are we changing systems? Are we changing processes? Are we changing performance metrics, or all of the above, right? It's like, how big is this? We also look at like, how cross-functional is this, right? Is this limited to one team? Is it limited, or is it multiple teams? Is it an end-to-end process redesign, right? All of that will define, the support that you and need to provide, or the experience that you need to create, because then it's not just the experience for one team or one individual, right? It's for many. And you kind of have to customize that even depending on your audience, right? How you engage with sales is different than how you engage with manufacturing, right? And so
I love
that,
that.
yeah,
Yeah. No, sorry, I didn't mean to hop in
go for
there.
it. Yeah.
um, and so when you are going through this process, let's say you have, I love the examples you use of the different kinds of change that you are enabling and you're mapping out. Um, how do you know the right time to enter in milestones or points where you measure success my secondary question, so we can make it two-prong, is also, I think one of the biggest asks I consistently have is, inevitably, as you're aiming for change, there are, let's call the naysayers, right? Those who are not keen to implement this kind of change. How, those two things, how do you measure the milestones, the success points, and how do you deal with fractions of an organization that may not be completely on board?
Yeah, it's also a very good question. So we're bringing up the topic of, resistance. It's kind of that label that we tend to put on that, right? And to me, resistance sometimes has a little bit of that negative connotation of like, oh, we want people to be on board and they're not, right? I just see it as they're probably stuck with something, and we really need to understand what is making them stuck. And it could be many things, right? It's usually not willingness. They usually don't like sit tight and say, I don't want to do this. It's usually something that we haven't provided for them. Right? And it can go from, they're not really sure what's going on. Maybe we haven't really given them the big picture on why are we doing this? How does this connect to what you're doing within your job, within your department, right? They don't know, like, how is this going to impact me specifically on my job? Sometimes it's also fear, fear for the unknown. Like, I have done this so long. We have people that have maybe been in a role for a longer time, and like, they're experts in the system. They know everybody. They know the system. And now we're asking them to completely change what they're doing on a day-to-day. Yes, it creates some fear of like, will I be able to develop the skills and the knowledge that I need to be successful in the future? Right. So I see, resistance more as, where are people stuck, and what is it really that we need to provide them with for them to kind of move forward and help them to get unstuck. And although we bring a lot of magic as change experts, we lean a lot on our people managers for that. Right? They are really the experts in their teams. They're really who are, close to their teams, know, which individuals might have a little bit, maybe are stuck, and how to unstuck them, right? So we do, change enablement experts. We might help to design the experience, but we also rely a lot on other individuals to kind of help execute on that experience, including our people managers.
Mm-hmm. So the second part of that question was success, measuring success. When would be the right time to set up the milestones to determine what level of success you may be at during the change evolution?
Yeah, and so the way I look at success and measuring different milestone in that implementation or change journey, it all starts with awareness, right? There's things, and even at a higher level, it's what can you do before you actually go live, before you expect people to execute on the change, right? And there's a lot that you can do. And within that, you can also measure things. So the first thing is the awareness. Like, are people aware that this is coming? Right? We could do a survey, or we can, do a touch base with their managers. Have you communicated this? So the first phase is, do people know what's happening and why we're doing this? Right? And you can measure that. Right? The second phase is, provide. Do people understand how this will change their job? Like, very specifically, what do you want me to do differently tomorrow? Right? And you can measure that as well. You can ask them, like, do you understand how this is going to change your job? Right? It's logic, it's straightforward, but that is kind of that next stage. And then comes the training, right? Then comes, how do we now develop the skills, develop knowledge, and even there we can do knowledge checks and really understand, what are all the things that they need to know and do to be successful, and kind of, do evaluate whether or not they're there, right? And sometimes we can do an overall readiness. They call it a readiness assessment, where you assess and understand through a survey or conversations where people Are they missing anything? Is there anything else that we need to put in place for them, to be ready to kind of run with it? And all of that we can measure before we go live. Then after go live, that's where we look at adoption. And adoption is very closely connected with the benefits you're trying to get out from this change, right? Because we normally companies change for a reason, right? Sometimes it might feel like maybe the reason is not known to us, but often we change for a reason, right? And there's certain benefits, whether it's increase of sales, cost reductions, efficiencies, better employee experience, better customer experience. There's always a reason, and we're usually pretty good at kind of defining what are those criteria and measurements. But what you will see is if we don't get to those objectives, if we don't see that we're getting the benefits, often it's because we don't have adoption.
I mean, you really do mention some points that, to be honest, I've never worked in a company that has had change enablement. I have, I think, in relation to customer focused type initiatives, there's been more focus on change because, of course, that drives the revenue. But especially in-house, focused on, say, people strategies, I don't recall, I guess I should say, having a function dedicated to that internal change within an organization. So as you're talking about all of this, I'm reminiscing to moments where maybe it was added to my plate as, oh, you already do this, so we'll just put that into the pile too. Could you please handle that? And what you're really reminding me of is, wow, those were large scale change initiatives. They weren't identified. It wasn't said this will be change enablement. So I'm thinking to our listeners who are in smaller organizations who maybe see a need for change. It's not directly tied to their job, or it's not a title they're giving to solely focus on it, but they're doing it in addition to their other tasks day in, day out. And you're talking about some really concerted processes here where you create the map, you look at the journey that's ahead, you begin to evaluate, assess, is each individual in the organization ready? Are they aware of this impending change? So you're talking communication, you're talking data and analytics, you're speaking to also potentially creating some personas or mapping. How much of that is a byproduct of the training you went through ProSci versus how much of it came out of the several decades you've been doing change management in your professional working world, or how much of that is your thought leadership that you've compiled from a mixture of both?
It's a mixture of both. And, if I look back at my almost 22 years in the corporate world, I joke with myself. I mean, the first 10 years, so the first half of that, I did not have any framework that I was aware of or any formal training in change, but somehow was always volunteered to lead change. Right? And so change is also intuitive, right? So we know that we need to communicate, right? We know that explaining the why will help motivate people to get buy-in and lean in and contribute. Right? We know that we need to send people to training to get the necessary skills and get familiar with the system that they're going to be able to use in the future. Right? All of that is very intuitive. And to our listeners that don't have a change enablement department or team, you probably are doing a lot of those things anyway. I think what maybe a more formal training or education can help with is sort of a framework on how to do it well. Right? If we all know that communication is important, but what does good communication look like in terms of like, what do you put in there? How do you customize your messages? What do you consider at the beginning of the change that you need to communicate on versus in the middle versus at the end, right? And so it's almost like you probably have all the pieces of the puzzle and you're doing some form intuitively in your day to day, where the formal education and going, more deep into knowledge and books and all of that really helped me is kind of solidify like what I was doing was actually good. And now I have other tools that can really help me, especially for the large scale change enablement. Because I do think, because now you can make the argument, say, you know what, we don't need change enablement. We're already doing it. Well, first of all, maturity in each company is different, right? And secondly, especially for large scale changes, you might want to consider the expert because they can really help you think through what the plan looks like, and have that knowledge of the framework, best practices, things that didn't work. They also help kind of empower everybody else on the project to do their role. We provide a lot of support to leaders, and not just in like, here is the communication material, but one thing, for example, that I've done in multiple companies is before a big transformation or change initiative, we do workshops for people leaders and help them, share with them, here's kind of what the process is that people go through, how to deal with potential people that get stuck or, might show some resistance, right? A lot around how to build a culture for change, so I think that is also where a change expert can come in and really help kind of paint that bigger picture, connect the dots, and provide that support, and work with everybody else that has a role.
I love how you said it's intuitive, because I do think it is intuitive, but where the tremendous value can come into, say, partnering with, a change expert, or maybe those who get voluntold in their roles that they're going to be doing change. It takes a certain perspective to be able to step outside of being in the organization, in the bit of the whirlpool that happens, and instead step outside and say, okay, so we want to put this change in motion. How do we do it? It's really hard to be sitting in the day in, day out tornado of to-dos in the culture of an organization, living it, breathing it, being a part of it, and also step outside and look and say, well, here's the change we need. This is how we're going to execute it. And sort of it creates distance maybe, or the perspective to make it successful requires a certain level of distance.
Yeah, we're often the neutral party. Yeah, because
go ahead.
The neutral party, because sometimes when you as a leader or individual, trying to bring change, are too close to it, it's hard to step back. And a neutral party can come in, and even a great example would be like having difficult conversations about this, right? Sometimes, there's certain changes that are really impactful and sometimes negative, perceived by associates or by employees, and where we can come in is kind of help, we call it change conversations, and just let people share their concerns, with a neutral party. It's like, I don't agree with this, or what about that? And so that's part of it too, that you can give them a forum to kind of share what's on their mind, and they're not always kind of willing to do that with their manager.
So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that while you stumbled into change enablement, you have developed a passion for it over the time you've been really living in this space as your professional career. So that passion creates a lot of energy, right? To develop your own plans, your own processes, and sort of carry forward what you started with a ProSci training to where you are today. Do you have any takeaways for our listeners today to that they could lean into, especially those maybe that are not given a full-time change enablement team, but instead, making change happen within their organization and carrying their full-time roles? Do you have expertise, passion that you can share from that standpoint?
Absolutely. And yeah, good observation. I can talk about this topic for hours. I sincerely love what I do because I really feel that I contribute to making change smoother for people because it can be challenging. But yeah, I actually, a couple of weeks ago, I sat down and reflected on kind of my journey and all my experience over the years. And I wrote down my own model and I'll share it with everyone here. And a little bit of context, I'll share the model and we'll bring it up in a minute, but a little bit of context because I've worked with different models over the year, obviously at CAR with ProSci, with the bridges model of the transitions. There's some custom models that we had in companies and models are good because it gives you that framework that you need to kind of understand, how to do this well, how to map this journey, how to map this experience for a specific change. So, and the models that really connected with me were more kind of outcome based. What is the type of experience? What is the type of outcome that we want to create? Because they're also more tangible. And so they're kind of easier to understand and easier to connect specific actions to. And so my model is called impact. So the impact model describes the outcomes, describes the experience that we want to create for people going through change. And some of it we actually talked about on the podcast, right? This is kind of a nice summary of bringing it all together and kind of connecting the dots, right? And you can use this as kind of a framework to then put actions behind it. And so the first thing that people need to go through change, we talked about it, they want to know what's going on. So the I of impact stands for inform. What is happening? How is this connecting with or connected to what we do as a company, as a department for my role? The second component or outcome experience is we want people to be motivated about this. We want people to contribute, lean in, right? And motivation is all about, yes, understanding why we're doing it, what's potentially in it for them. But this is also about having a platform for them to share concerns, right? If they can flesh out concerns, ask questions, that will also contribute to that motivation. Then the third component is providing direction. We talked about this as well, is how do we explain what is specifically changing in my day-to-day? Right, that's that direction. And how do you want me to behave differently in the future? New systems, processes, roles, and responsibilities, and laying that out to people will really help see them, and position themselves in the future. Then the fourth component, that's where the training comes in. Now we have to also show them how to do it, right? Acquire the skills and knowledge that they need to be able to execute on it, right? And here in this journey, we reached a critical point because it's at this point that associates, employees will be ready to run with this. They understand what's happening. They understand why. They fleshed out all of their concerns. They know how this is going to change their day-to-day job, and they developed the skills to do it. Right? Now they're actually able to execute. And that's where we're going that next phase of crystallizing the behavior. That's where we're going to look at adoption we talked about, right? Are they, following the new processes? Are they adopting the new roles and responsibilities, using the new system? And crystallizing behavior is also developing that proficiency that they need to feel like they're doing it well. Another component in this one is, or another part of crystallizing behavior is sometimes when change is hard, we revert back to our old ways of doing things, or we do workarounds, right? But if we, work in our old ways, then we might not get to the benefits that we, set out to achieve. So we want to avoid that and understand, why are we doing this? Why are we putting workarounds in? And, how can we get to the right behavior, right? So we crystallize it. Okay, we got it. We're proficient. But then there's an extra step after that is, how do we now really thrive in this world? Right? And that's where continuous improvements come in. That's where, no change is right first time. In my 22 years, I have yet to see one. We implement, but then we think of, what about this? And how do we, even improve this? And what other skills would be beneficial for a team to kind of really be good at this, right? And so that's kind of that last, how do we make them thrive?
So okay, first of all, I love the model. I think that it really does break down key steps. As I mentioned before, I've definitely been tossed into the ring, not feeling like I was necessarily a change expert, but added to my role. Or maybe I was tossed into the ring and I had more experience and I did follow my intuition and I was able to, not perfectly, but probably follow this general guideline you have here. And one of the things I love that you mentioned in the Thrive section, which is this system and this model can really work well. Change is coming and you're not maybe pivoting on a dime or being super agile. So you're aware of an upcoming change, it's large scale, let's put these steps in place. Yet not all change works with such foresight or is so clearly laid out in advance. What's your counsel to our listeners as they experience that kind of ad hoc change, maybe a more reactive place rather than proactive in planning for change?
Yeah, absolutely. And that happens regularly, right? Where we have to implement something in a very short time frame and we don't necessarily have the time to do all this due diligence and kind of plan for it. So this is really ideal state. Right? Now, when we don't have the time and we need to be agile and we need to implement something quickly, whether or not we're going to be successful really depends on the type of change it is. Right? If it's something small scale where people have been ready for this, like, oh, finally we're getting this new system because the old one is so painful, right? And it's it's limited in scope. People are ready for that. Like there's leadership buy-in, like we got to do this, and there's momentum. It'll probably be okay, right? Is where you might run into issues and challenges is when with those larger, very impactful changes with, you're changing systems and processes and roles and responsibilities at the same time for multiple teams in a very short time frame. What you'll see is that you might have to do a little bit of damage control because the reality is that people would like to know what's going on. They want to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, how is this changing. And so when you're just pushing a change through, what you will experience is maybe you skip inform, motivate, and providing direction, and you send them straight to training because that's the only thing that you got time for. Well, what you will experience is people will come into the training and say, why am I here? What is going on? This is how my job is going to change. Like, wait, I'm not necessarily okay with this. Mm-hmm. So they're not ready to kind of jump in and learn the skills, and they might be a little bit distracted. It causes a lot of frustration, because if you do that, people will feel like change is happening to them. And ideally, we want them to feel like it's happening through them and that they have a voice, because that's really what makes them lean in and engage, right? So you will experience the downsides of pushing that through. Having said that, that doesn't mean that you can't recover from that. It's just as being aware that is a risk. If you're pushing this through, that is a risk. And what that might result in is a lot of rework. Because then we implement something, but not everybody is adopting it, right? Or not using it proficiently because they felt like the training was rushed, they weren't focused, and they sort of got it, but not really. They do a lot of workarounds, right? And they're not yet in that mindset of continuous improvements because they're still learning how to actually execute on this.
And I love how you said that one, you can recover. You'll just probably be doing rework. So you can pick up at any one of these steps in the model. It's just that if you skip some of the steps, it may add more work in the process of getting it successfully launched to that crystallized behavior and thriving point than if you were to begin at the beginning and go through each step in order. So, and I love
want
that.
to add one more thing, Olivia,
Yeah.
because I think this is important. It will also impact your outcomes. It impacts your benefits.
What?
Because if you skip steps and people are not ready to use your system or follow the processes or you know, and start working in that new way, and you don't have full adoption, then you're not going to get the benefits, and your benefits might be delayed, right? If you have to recover and do retraining and recommunicating and re-engaging, you recover, but at what cost? And sometimes companies are willing to take that risk, and because there's other reasons why we have to do this, right? It's just being aware that is the risk, and how are we going to then, recover from that and support the organization to get to the benefits that we set out to do.
Mm-hmm. So that actually segues really well into my sort of last thought, because one piece, we've talked all about how beneficial and passionate, and you can own the space even if it's not your full-time job. You can do it really successfully. You can partner with an expert. You can work a model like this and even apply it to smaller change initiatives as well as large scale initiatives. So all these tools. But my question is, not every change initiative is successful. And I love to end on a high note, but just factoring in that component, that it can be much harder to make the change initiative successful if you don't follow some of these steps you've provided in the impact model. How do you either recover? How do you scrap the project and just say, okay, there wasn't a readiness? Because I did hear you comment on a readiness and an appetite is necessary for the success of a change initiative. What do you do when it's not successful, and how do you determine that?
What do you do when it's not successful? Well, sometimes we do get called in a little bit late in the game, and then because we see that we don't have adoption. And I think the first thing is really understanding what is causing the non-adoption. Because it's not necessarily on the change enablement side. There's multiple things. There's multiple things that will impact whether or not ultimately we have adoption, right? Sometimes what happens is we implement a solution that is not working. So I'm sure we've all been there. Or the solution is doing only partially of what we need to get to the benefits, right? So the solution side, we really need to analyze, where is the breakdown in adoption, right? Is it a solution? Is it really because we haven't trained enough people, or people don't understand how to execute it well? Is it because, sometimes the new way of working is more difficult than the old way of working. And so it's easy to kind of revert back, and we haven't set expectations with senior leadership about that, what that means for performance. Right. So I think it's when we see that change is not successful, it's really understanding why is it not successful. And there's so many different components. Yes, it could be on the change management side of we haven't informed people or given enough training, but it could also be the solution that we're implementing, and it's really not necessarily what they call it, the minimum adoption product or something. They call it MPV, but there's something about change too. Like, what's the minimum that people are willing to adopt to? So that's from a solution side. And sometimes it's also, maybe it's not being set as a priority. Maybe we don't have leadership sponsorship for this initiative, and there's too many priorities at the same time. Right. So when an initiative is not successful, it's really good to understand what's at the basis. And then let's all, get together and understand if this is what is going on, then how do we correct this? Right? Do we stop using it for a while, go back to the old way of working and retry, or hey, it's just a matter of really building proficiency and more robust training, or we really need, leadership to put this as a priority and remove any conflicting priorities to really get this done. Right. So yeah, I know it's not a single thing that can contribute to all of that, but sometimes it happens that we get called in and you just analyze the situation, what is really causing the failure, and let's try again.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Well, I think one of the biggest learnings is to say, no, this isn't working, and be able to be honest about that and objective from a business standpoint. It's not personal, it's not necessarily pointing fingers, but it is not successful. And let's just peel back some of the layers to talk about why. Or even more profound, I think, in change management is also the place that you sometimes need to hold, which is, I understand you want to make this change, but right now this change will not be successful if we proceed forward because of X, Y, and Z. And be willing to be that advocate for when will it make sense? What groundwork could we do to make it successful, right? And really kind of think of tilling the soil before you get into actually initiating even the inform piece of your impact model, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's part of it too, is raising, potential risk in the beginning. And then with those risks, okay, how are we going to address that? Or what can we do to kind of mitigate those? Absolutely.
Annemie, I have absolutely loved having you on the Culture Chat today. Before we wrap, do you have any last words, insights, passion, knowledge for change you'd want to share with our audience?
Oh, you put me on the spot here. We need another hour.
Well,
Passion, knowledge. Okay, let me think. One of the things, and I shared it today, but it was kind of hidden in one of my explanations. But it's something that one of my old, she's not old, my former managers kind of brought into our change practice. So as change happens through people. And sometimes and that means that we have to involve people in the process. And involving does not necessarily mean, like, if you're building a new system, help them develop the system. Part of involving is also ask for their input and ask if they have any questions. Share that, inform and motivate. That's part of the involving too. It's like, hey, we thought of you, and here's what's going to happen. Here's how this is, why we're doing it, and how this is going to change your role. Is that if we do that, people will feel more ownership, and more connected to what we're doing. Because if we leave that out, the I am the I, the M, and the P, they will just feel like things are happening to them.
I love that.
And you haven't even shared what this is about. You haven't asked for my opinion, and now you want me to execute. That's painful. And yeah.
I think that is a nugget of gold. So let's just say that one more time. Change happens through people, which makes everyone's efforts towards change management so much more successful. We don't want people to feel change happens to them.
Exactly.
The quote of Annemie. I love that. I love it. So we're going to wrap on that note. Thank you to our audience for joining us on the Culture Chat, where conversation and culture connect. Please feel free to subscribe to our channel. We hope to see you for our next episode. Thank you, Annemie.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.